The thing that is most effectively keeping people from becoming environmentalists right now is not denial. It's not apathy. It's not the fossil fuel lobby, though that's doing plenty of damage on its own. It is a standard of purity operating inside the climate movement itself. One that is specifically designed to feel like accountability. And that is, in practice, doing the opposite. That's a hard claim, and it deserves a careful argument. So here is what this video is going to do. It's going to define what eco-purity culture actually is, precisely not as a personality critique. It's going to show the mechanism by which it reduces participation rather than raising it. And it's going to give you a more accurate framework for understanding your own imperfect engagement, not as a deficit to be corrected, as the only version of participation that has ever been realistic at the scale this problem requires. Start with the definition, because this is not about toxic individuals. It's not about the person who corrected you for using a paper straw. It's not a personality type or a community flaw. Eco-purity culture is a structural norm. It evaluates environmental identity by completeness of practice, by how many boxes are checked, how many compromises have been refused, how far someone has gone in purging their life of contradiction. Under this norm, you are an environmentalist to the degree that your behavior is consistent. And you are a hypocrite to the degree that it isn't. The problem is not that this standard demands effort. The problem is what it demands effort toward and who it inevitably leaves outside. Because here is what the research on identity and behavior actually shows. When people feel that an identity requires completeness to be legitimate, when partial engagement doesn't count, they don't respond by achieving completeness. They disengage. This pattern has a name in behavioral psychology. It's called identity-contingent motivation failure, and it shows up consistently across domains: dieting, exercise, financial behavior, and yes, environmental action. The mechanism is straightforward. If the identity is only available to people who do it perfectly, then the first significant failure doesn't prompt recommitment, it prompts exit. I tried. I failed. I'm clearly not that kind of person. I'll stop pretending. That exit is not weakness. It is a rational response to an impossible standard, and it is happening at a scale that the climate movement cannot afford. And that brings us to the part most content skips, because it requires sitting with a genuinely uncomfortable number. The people eco-purity culture drives away are not the periphery of the climate movement. They are the majority of everyone the climate movement will ever reach. Think about what the realistic population of climate-engaged people actually looks like. It's not people who have restructured their entire lives around zero-impact living. That group is real, and it's small, and it was probably always going to show up regardless of the cultural norm. The realistic population is people who care, genuinely, persistently, at some real cost to themselves, and who also drive occasionally when transit isn't viable. Buy the plastic-wrapped option when the alternative isn't affordable. Run the AC in July because they have children or a health condition, and book a flight once every few years to see someone they love. These are not edge cases. These are not people who haven't tried hard enough. These are people navigating real constraints inside systems that were not designed to make the sustainable choice the easy one. And eco-purity culture has a clear verdict on them. Not quite enough. The behavioral research on this is worth sitting with. Studies on moral disengagement consistently show that when people feel their identity in a domain has been revoked, when they've failed the implicit test, they don't just reduce their behavior in that area. They rationalize away the entire domain. If I can't do it right, I might as well not think about it. The technical term is moral disengagement. The practical outcome is a person who used to bring their own bag, used to think about their food choices, used to show up for things, and quietly stopped. Not because they stopped caring, because the standard told them their caring didn't count. And the cost of that multiplied across everyone who has received that message from eco-communities, from social media, from the internal voice that learned the purity standard and started applying it, is not abstract. It is a measurable reduction in the total number of people engaging with climate issues. The movement needs to sit with that. Purity culture, whatever its intentions, is functioning as a participation filter with the wrong criteria. It is selecting for consistency instead of direction. And consistency at the realistic scale of a mass movement is not available. Direction is. Here is the reframe, and it's worth being precise about it because there is a version of this argument that sounds like lower the bar so everyone feels good. And that is not what this is. The bar doesn't need to be lower. It needs to be aimed at the right thing. Purity culture aims the bar at completeness, at the absence of contradiction, at a version of eco-identity that requires your behavior to be consistent with your values across most or all situations. That bar was always going to exclude most people, not because most people don't care, but because most people live inside constraints that make consistent alignment structurally difficult. The cost of food, the design of cities, the infrastructure of daily life, the demands of work and caregiving, these are not excuses. They are the actual conditions under which real people make real choices. The bar that actually serves the movement is aimed at direction. Are you moving toward alignment, even inconsistently? Are you making some choices differently because of what you value, even when you can't make all of them? Are you still in the conversation, still caring, still paying attention, still showing up in whatever partial, imperfect, interrupted way your life allows? If yes, that is not a lesser form of participation. That is the primary form. It is the only form that exists at the scale a mass movement requires. The research on social change consistently shows that broad, imperfect participation produces more systemic momentum than narrow, perfect participation. This is not a consolation prize for people who can't do better. It is a description of how movements actually change the conditions they're operating inside. Small, consistent pressure from many imperfect actors shifts norms. Norms shift policy. Policy shifts infrastructure. Infrastructure shifts what's possible for everyone, including the people for whom sustainability is currently a structural barrier. The person who drives to the farmer's market because transit doesn't reach it, who buys one less item of fast fashion this year, who has started paying attention to their local elections because someone told them it matters, that person is not falling short of the standard. That person is the standard, because that person, multiplied by the number of people the movement needs to reach, is what actual momentum looks like. Your imperfect engagement was never the problem. The standard that told you it was, that is the problem. And that standard has a cost the whole movement pays. If what this video named is something you want to move with, not perfectly, but actually, there's a 30-day structure in the description built exactly for this. One action per day, designed for people with real lives, real budgets, and no interest in being perfect. Not a challenge that resets if you miss a day. A practice that continues. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now for the internal objection that this argument tends to produce, because it's a legitimate one, and it deserves an honest answer. Doesn't accountability require standards? If everyone gets to call themselves an environmentalist without doing much, doesn't that hollow out the identity entirely? Yes, accountability requires standards. The question is which standards, aimed at what? Purity culture's standard measures the finish line. Have you arrived? Are you consistent? Is your life free of contradiction? The problem is that the finish line, for most people navigating real constraints, is not reachable, not because they lack commitment, but because the conditions of their lives don't make it accessible. Measuring the finish line excludes most of the people who are actually moving. A direction-based standard measures something different. Not, have you arrived, but are you moving, and in which direction, and with what honesty about where you are. That standard holds people accountable. It's just accountable for something achievable, and something that, when sustained across a realistic number of people, actually produces the systemic pressure that moves the finish line closer for everyone. What this looks like in practice is worth naming, because abstract reframes can dissolve without concrete shape. It looks like a person who doesn't buy organic produce every week, but has stopped buying from one specific company because they learned what it funds. It looks like someone who still drives, but has started attending city council meetings about public transit funding. It looks like a parent who doesn't have the language yet to talk to their kids about climate without terrifying them, but is reading about it and trying. It looks like someone who bought the fast fashion item because there was no budget for the alternative, and who is angry about that, and who is directing that anger somewhere useful. These are not people failing to be environmentalists. These are environmentalists, imperfect ones. The only kind there will ever be in sufficient number to matter. The eco-identity worth building is not the one that requires sainthood to sustain. It is the one that can survive a Thursday in February when the right choice isn't available and you make the wrong one and you show up again on Friday anyway. That is coherence. Not the absence of contradiction, the persistence of direction through it. If this reframe is one you want to work with more specifically, not as a concept, but as a daily practice, the 30-day structure in the description was built for exactly this. Imperfect engagement, real life, no reset button. Link in the description and the pinned comment. What was the moment eco-purity culture made you feel like your caring didn't count? And what did you do with that? So here is where this actually lands. Eco-purity culture is not a collection of difficult personalities. It is a structural norm with a measurable cost. And the cost is paid by everyone who was told their imperfect engagement didn't qualify and who, quietly, believed it. You are not required to believe it, not as reassurance, as a more accurate description of your actual situation. The climate movement does not need more people who have achieved perfect consistency. It does not have a shortage of people who feel guilty about their inconsistency. What it has a shortage of is people who are still in the room after the guilt stopped being useful. People who have decided that imperfect, honest, persistent engagement is worth more than the performance of an identity they can't sustain. That is what you are if you've made it to this part of the video. Still in the room, still asking whether what you do matters, still carrying the question instead of setting it down. That cost gets named here because it doesn't get named enough elsewhere. The gap between your values and your life is real. So are the systems that produced it. So is the care that keeps showing up despite it. You are not a fraud for falling short of a standard that was always going to exclude most people. You are not a saint for the moments you've managed to meet it. You are an imperfect person moving in a direction, inside conditions you did not design, and still, despite everything, paying attention. Imperfect and coherent. That is not a consolation prize. That is the only version of this that has ever been available to most people. And it is enough. It is, in fact, the thing the movement actually runs on.